It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Throughout the ages, how many times have the wisest of the human race warned of the tyranny that pretends to save, while simultaneously tightening the noose around the neck of their victims? Consider this quote from Bertrand Russell. Certified lunatics are shut up because of their proneness to violence when their pretensions are questioned. The uncertified variety of lunatics, of course, are given the control of powerful armies and can inflict death and disaster upon all sane men within their reach, end quote. And there is this reminder quote from Arthur Miller, who said this: few of us can easily surrender our belief that society must somehow make sense. The thought that the state has lost its mind and is punishing so many innocent people is intolerable, and so the evidence has to be internally denied, end quote. I never wanted to do this job. Never. I'm not political. I never have been. I wanted only to wander and work in the forest alone and in solitude, restoring habitat. I wanted only to take care of the forest until my final hour. I never wanted to man such a post as that which I find myself in at this time, but my conscience will not allow me to do otherwise. For many decades, populations all over the world have been subjected to a long and growing list of experiments conducted on them without their knowledge or their consent, experiments from which there is no return. Last week, Geoengineeringwatch.org was forwarded 3 pages from a 1978 report prepared by former U.S. Navy officer Gerald W. Admires. The report was for the, quote, Food, Weather, Water session of the 1978 National Conference of Educators. Though we only received photocopies of these 3 aged and partially damaged documents, these 3 pages are indeed alarming and an absolute confirmation of what Geoengineeringwatch.org has tried to warn about for well over a decade. That covert climate engineering operations conducted by nations all over the world, either actively or passively, were tearing apart Earth's climate and life support systems. Listen carefully to this document, again by a former U.S. Navy officer. Quote, Sir Bernard Lovell, in his book, In the Center of Immensities, 1978 publication, stated this comment: more than ever before in our century, society was persuaded to give great material support to scientific activities in the belief that the discoveries would inevitably, in some way, be of practical benefit to humanity. Already we see that this is not the case. The more science has progressed, so the divisions of good and evil in its application have disappeared. The belief in automatic material progress by means of scientific discovery and application has become a tragic myth of our age, end quote. The report from U.S. Navy officer Gerald Admires continues. He says, in essence, Sir Lovell's message to society and its educators is there's no free lunch in the long run. Your technology exacts a greater price than mankind can pay. The final toll is society itself and the environment, and immeasurable suffering. The report continues, scientists in their zeal to unlock, quote, Pandora's box, given a world population as, quote, guinea pigs and the earth as their laboratory, have experimented the world into a juggernaut of death and destruction. Some scientists wail, quote, we cannot go back, end quote. In a way, the report states they are right. Continuing with the report, however, the scientists can stop their experiments long enough to watch nature regain some semblance of equilibrium. True, we will all suffer at some length, but technology's cure without wisdom is far worse than our disease of greed and lust. Water is the unique liquid without which life, as we know it, cannot exist. Once the supply was relatively prevalent. In nature's hydrological cycle, a delicate balance was obvious. It rose from the seas, the oceans, the lakes, and the rivers. The plants drew water from the soil and returned it via the atmosphere. brooks, rivers, streams, lakes, oceans. The energies released in the process once cleansed the air we breathe. Then along came scientists. Quote, we can regulate the water to everyone, end quote. All can have their, quote, rightful share, end quote, the report states, and continues, they promised. Politicians and merchants joined the chant. The trusting public responded with their wages earned with hard work. Unknown to the public, there was another price to pay. In order to, quote, adjust precipitation, scientists had to, quote, adjust the amount of moisture in the atmosphere. If the air mass was too dry, they extracted more water from the ocean and lakes as their air mass moved eastward. The electrical properties of the atmosphere had to be regulated. Solar energy had to be, quote, adjusted to regulate the temperature differences. One of the principal devices used for, quote, adjustment is the use of smoke of various elements ejected from aircraft at appropriate altitudes. Reduced electrical potential had to be increased to, quote, trigger the release of precipitation, quote, locked in tiny ice crystals high in the atmosphere. So ionized clouds of gas, i.e. plasma, were and are ejected from high-flying aircraft. By these means and other intentionally induced atmospheric phenomena, scientists threw the hydrological cycle and wind systems out of harmonic equilibrium, and now, through erroneously programmed computers, are trying to provide the world with, quote, packaged precipitation according to, quote, users' desires and for a generous fee. Report continues with this. Some scientists hold that members of their profession have an obligation to the general public to describe scientific experiments as best they can, while others in the field apparently attempt to mislead the public. The sporadic yet continuous growth of efforts to control precipitation for, quote, world benefit has had a profound, deleterious effect on world climate. The constant injection of various elements into the upper troposphere has established a high, at times almost invisible veil of gaseous iodine, halogens, ammonia, and carbon dioxide ions, which will, like volcanic dust, remain there, affecting our climate for years. Various efforts to explain our recent anomalous climate continue to avoid at length discussion of weather modification activities. Buried are the gems of wisdom uttered by Dr. Irving Langmuir, the man who had such high hopes for benevolent usage of his many scientific discoveries. Until today's weather scientists admit to their 30-year-old folly of raping our skies, climate patterns will continue to rain quick and slow death and destruction around the world on a greedy, lustful human race and all of nature's innocent life forms. Politicians, sociologists, and scientists currently point to the dangers of immediate world famine because, quote, they say, we cannot provide enough food for an overburdening world population, end quote. Yet, every effort to provide technology to increase food production has, in fact, reduced man's ability to produce crops of balanced nutrition. Furthermore, the report states, it is a matter of public record that some nations withhold food supplies from the needy in order to drive up prices. Those nations with an overabundance of food supply will continue to find a market in those nations who suffer from science-induced climate anomalies, i.e. weather warfare. Final paragraph from this report. Educators have a hard choice to make, whether to continue the current deceptive, propagandized, quote, conditioning educational system or to teach the truth of how to live in harmony with the world's ecosystem. End of report from former U.S. Navy veteran Gerald W. Admires, again from 1978. All of this report from 1978 stating that these programs had already been in operation for 30 plus years, exactly when geoengineeringwatch.org has stated these programs were first fully deployed. Question, how is it possible that such an unbelievably obvious scenario that's happening in our skies can be hidden in plain sight for over 70 years and blatantly denied by all official sources, by the corporate-controlled media, and unfortunately, I'm very sorry to say, the majority of the population still buying that official denial instead of what they can see with their own eyes, what they could easily research if they would take the time to do so. While carefully crafted political theaters of mass distraction and division are carried out by the criminally corrupt corporate media, while orchestrated scenarios are being inflicted on global societies, in the background, our collective futures are being carved in stone. To dovetail on the report from 1978 that I just covered, how dire and immediate is our collective horizon today? What does the data reveal? The following statement was just provided to geoengineeringwatch.org from the former NASA contract engineer that has worked directly with geoengineeringwatch.org with state-of-the-art UV metering equipment supplied to him by us to monitor the radically increasing UV radiation levels that are now bombarding our planet. Though he is himself now battling severe health issues, he was compelled to pen this report that I'm about to cover. It starts with this. Quote, okay, everyone, brace for impact, end quote, exclamation point. The report continues from this former NASA contract engineer, again, just issued 2 days ago. Quote, the collapsing upper ozone layer. Recent data has shown that the trend line model created from data gathered at Mount Hamilton on October 5th of 2016 is still accurate and correct. That by 2025, if all remains the same, you won't be able to grow crops in direct sunlight. No significant repairs to the upper ozone layer have been established according to recent data, though NASA would like you to think everything is okay. The report continues. This is a life-threatening scenario to everyone on the planet. Sensationalism? Question mark? Yes. By whatever means necessary to open those closed eyes and minds that put dire truths into a, quote, conspiracy theory category. The data collected over the last 4 years also has another dire issue. Micro holes in the upper ozone layer. These holes range from roughly 15 feet to 10 miles. 15 feet represents approximately 10 milliseconds of Earth's rotation and is the integration period set into he names the meter. It's an ILT 950 UV spectral radiometer. To my knowledge, this NASA contract engineer states, no one is gathering this data with this resolution, except for him, of course, working with geoengineeringwatch.org. He continues, micro holes in the upper ozone layer will cause you to have an immediate sting reaction on your sunlit exposed skin. This can send 95% of the deadly solar UV radiation straight through you, your kids, your pets, eyes especially, and wherever you have planted. The spike in UVC during microhole transit, again, UVC, the last spectrum of UV radiation before X-ray. We all know how harmful that is, and it's hitting the surface now, UVC is. He continues with the report. The UVC spike during microhole transition has been measured to be as much as 13 times higher than data gathered before and after the hole transits, and this damages all life, DNA, and RNA. His report continues, a typical rocket launch through our atmosphere will create an 11-mile wide hole in the upper ozone layer, and atmospheric recombination of O3 molecules within the atmosphere can take weeks, sometimes years to return to normal. Please note there is no such thing as, quote, normal at this time in our Earth's history. These holes may continue in our atmosphere much like the giant spot on Jupiter. Sadly, it is in my opinion that the bullfrogs Dane has been rescuing, those that didn't make it, may be a direct result from a micro hole in the upper ozone layer. I continue this research, this contract engineer states, with many hopes of others taking notes, and even some of those with enough resources to afford such expensive atmospheric measuring devices like LiDAR and several thousand strategically placed ILT 950 UV spectral radiometers. That's the device that geoengineeringwatch.org supplied to this contract engineer. X-ray and cosmic gamma detectors, that the placement of these devices would help us all here on Earth to know the status of the upper ozone layer. He finishes with this. When it's gone, i.e. the ozone layer, we are all gone. End of report from the NASA contract engineer. As has been stated many times on this broadcast, even if we faced no other challenges, and obviously there are many, the deterioration and near-term potential collapse of the ozone layer is, in and of itself, an extinction-level scenario if we remain on the current course. Take a moment to consider the two reports I just covered, one from 1978 and one from 2 days ago. Both reports are important pieces to the overall puzzle. Both reports add further confirmation to the conclusion that geoengineeringwatch.org, based on all available data, has tried to sound the alarm about for over a decade. That short of nuclear cataclysm, the ongoing interference with Earth's life support systems in the form of weather warfare, climate engineering, is the greatest and most immediate threat we collectively face, short of nuclear cataclysm. The climate science community tells us that a two-passenger single propeller-driven plane with a few flares on the wings modifies the weather. But then the same so-called scientists flatly deny that military tankers dumping as much as 100 tons of particulates in our skies on a single flight, leaving a massive, lingering, expanding swath of heavy metal and chemical filth from horizon to horizon, isn't actually doing a thing. That's what they tell us. The canopy of contamination, they say, has no effect or impact. And yes, the betrayal of academia in so many arenas, simply conforming to the official